Welcome to our sharing on the second half of St. John's Gospel. We are continuing with the drama that we have begun in chapter 18, and we are looking at Jesus being arraigned before Annas the high priest. So let's begin with some reading. This is verse 15. Simon Peter, with another disciple, followed Jesus. The disciple who was known to the high priest went with Jesus into the high priest's palace. Notice the term palace. Peter stayed outside the door. So the other disciple, the one known to the high priest, went out, spoke to the woman who was keeping the door, and brought Peter in. The maid on duty at the door said to Peter, "Aren't you one of this man's disciples?" He answered, "I'm not." Now it was cold, and the servants and the guards had lit a charcoal fire, and they were standing there warming themselves. So Peter stood there too, warming himself with the others. Peter had only been brought in as far as the courtyard, not inside where John was. Okay, so here we have one of the dramatic incidents at the beginning of the Passion of Jesus concerning Simon Peter. Now, the Synoptic Gospels will do this in greater detail, but we'll stay with the way John is doing it. Notice John won't name himself, the other disciple. And we know who that other disciple is, it's John. Okay, and Peter stayed in the courtyard. Peter is completely unknown to the chief priests, but of course, they will get to know him very well after the resurrection, when he himself has to bear testimony before the same group of men that Jesus bore testimony to. At this particular moment, the thought of that would be completely incomprehensible to Peter. And so he has to stay out in the courtyard where, the attendants and the guards are, whereas the important people go in to where Jesus is. I showed you when we were doing the farewell discourse that Peter wanted to be with Jesus, and he has to learn what way you are to be with Jesus. The way he is with Jesus now is wrong, because he's operating on the level of below and Jesus is operating on the level of above. Now here we have the two-stage drama that I mentioned to you in the introduction, that we're now going to deal with Peter in the foreground and Jesus in the background, because Jesus is inside with the high priest and the important people inside, and Peter is outside. And just as Jesus is being interrogated about his disciples, his main disciple, his chief witness, is absolutely denying him. That's what John wants you to hear. Okay, so the master is inside, and Peter has already been asked, aren't you one of these? And he absolutely denies it. So verse 20 says that the high priest questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Poor Jesus, while he's actually being questioned about his ministry, is hearing Peter absolutely denying that he ever knew him. It must have been a terrifying stab in the heart for somebody who loved as much as Jesus loved. Peter should have left the Garden of Gethsemane and gone away to hide during this whole process, and he wouldn't have had this present fall that he's going to have now. But unfortunately, being at the wrong level, he is not going to bear witness to Jesus. Jesus is being questioned by the high priest and about the important people in the Sanhedrin, and this is the time for Peter, the chief among the disciples, to actually stand up and testify for his master, but he does the exact opposite. And so one of the things that John does very delicately, and you mightn't even notice it unless you stop long enough at each word, is that Jesus remains completely silent about his disciples. He only answers about himself. And here he continues to protect them. You have to go to St. Luke's Gospel to see that Jesus was very anxious about Peter making a fool of himself. And so he tries to get Peter to catch his eye. And when the cock crows, of course, Peter realizes what was said to him a little bit earlier. So here you've got Jesus in the background, remaining silent out of pure charity, but also concern for his disciples. And the thing he says about his own teaching is this. It's very, very interesting. I have spoken openly for all the world to hear. I have always taught in the synagogue and in the temple where the Jews, that is the Jewish people, meet, because they met every week in the synagogues and they met in the temple to have teaching from the rabbis, and they met in the temple to have their feasts as well. So I've spoken openly. I have said nothing in secret. Why are you asking me? He said. Ask my hearers what I taught. They know what I said. Now, Jesus is going to receive a bit of abuse for that kind of answer, but let's look at it first. Jesus is being interrogated about his disciples and about his teaching, and Peter is being interrogated. Peter is his chief disciple. Jesus is questioned by the high priest, the highest authority in the land. Peter is questioned just by a bystander, someone near him, nobody of authority. Jesus affirmed who he was. Peter denied everything. He not only denied that he was a disciple, he denied that he ever knew the man. He denied everything. So this is the night when people stumble, as I've told you about several times. Jesus acknowledges that he is the I am in front of anybody. He has no fear of anyone. And Peter's reaction is, I am not. I'm not a disciple. I'm not a believer. I'm not even a friend. I'm not even an acquaintance. It's really horrifying. Totally horrifying. At least John's silence is decent. There is dignity with it. John, by not opening his mouth, was able to be a witness to these events and to be able to pass on this information to future generations. Peter, by stumbling and saying all the wrong things, he has to leave, and he can't be a witness to these events. He actually doesn't hear the interrogation of Jesus. He doesn't hear Jesus' responses. He doesn't stay in a way that he can actually hear what's going on. And so Peter is no use as a witness here. It's really sad. And our wrong reactions under pressure also make us useless witnesses. Jesus received absolutely unnecessary abuse for what happened to him. And the reason for that is that in the eyes of the people in Annas' presence, Annas is the authority. He is the great high priest. He is the representative of God to the Jewish people. They see Jesus as a poor Galilean workman who thinks he's a prophet. And yeah, he's been going around working miracles. But they accused him of working the miracles through Beelzebub. Now he's claiming to be divine. He's claiming to be the Son of God. And so here he is talking back, in their opinion, to the high priest and telling the high priest, everybody in this room has heard me, which was true. Jesus spoke publicly in the temple. All the priests heard him, all the scribes, all the Pharisees. How do we know? Just look at the controversies in chapters 5 to 9 in this gospel alone, even if you don't go to the other gospels. Everywhere he went in Israel, the scribes and the Pharisees were ubiquitous. And they picked up on all the issues that he taught on, and they fought him every inch of the way. Everyone did hear his teaching, including Annas. But apparently they expected him to cower before this great religious authority. The Son of God fears no man. And any of us who have a right relationship with God, we also will fear no man. If we are the ones who will cower before people in high positions, then we're not much use as witnesses. Okay. It is amazing that poor Peter has really got to die to himself. But in a very short time, you just simply go to Acts chapter 4 and 5, and you find the same Peter and the same John standing before the same Sanhedrin, the same men that are interrogating Jesus. And they're able to testify with authority, and they're able to testify under the power of the Holy Spirit. And in that situation, Peter is fearless, absolutely fearless. He has absolutely no fear whatsoever of the Sanhedrin. So between this night and that event, which is only a very short time, if you think in terms of months or even weeks, it's probably months. The transformation of this man who's behaving like a jellyfish now, that he's totally transformed into a rock, the rock that the Lord can rely on. The transformation of Peter is one of the great, great miracles of the New Testament. It's something that we don't really look at enough, okay? But any of us who fall down to the level of below will be like Peter, and we won't be able to stand up and bear witness for Christ at all. But it took Jesus being lifted up on the cross and lifting up in glory for Peter to rise from the dead. And so it is a very important lesson for us all. You may have an important position in the church. That doesn't mean you're able to bear witness to Jesus. You may be an absolute nobody in the church and a nobody in the world, and you may be able to bear witness to Jesus because your relationship is right. So it's not your position of office that enables you to be a witness. It is your relationship with God and your relationship with Jesus. And so one of the bystanders decides to abuse Jesus. At these words, one of the guards standing by gave Jesus a slap in the face, saying, "Is that the way to answer the high priest?" And Jesus replied, "If there's something wrong in what I said, point it out. But if there is no offense in it, why do you strike me?" And this is a very, very important moment, okay? First of all, in case I forget to say it, this is not a proper trial. This is not a courtroom. This is not Jesus on trial. It's only a hearing. You'll notice there's nobody accusing Jesus. You'll notice that there's no jury. There's no judge. Nothing. And it's just that Jesus has to be arraigned before this man who considers himself the high priest, even when he has long since been deposed. But because Jesus said that he had spoken in public, I want to give you a couple of scriptures from the Old Testament. You always go back there looking for foundations. Why would Jesus emphasize to Annas that he has spoken in public for all the world to hear? If you go back to Isaiah chapter 45 and verse 19, you'll hear the Lord saying, "I am the Lord, I am unrivaled. I have not spoken in secret. I've not spoken in some corner of a darkened land. I have not said to Jacob's descendants, seek me in chaos. I, the Lord, speak with directness, and I speak with clarity." And that describes Jesus' teaching absolutely perfectly. Also in Isaiah 48, verse 16, you read, "Come near and listen to this. From the beginning, I have never spoken to you obscurely." So when you hear Jesus saying in John 18:20, "I have spoken openly for all the world to hear," that means he has spoken in their synagogues, he has spoken out in the open, he has spoken in the temple, he has spoken to the priests, he has spoken to absolutely everybody. So everybody in the room has actually heard him. So what Jesus is doing there is exposing the hypocrisy, exposing the darkness, exposing the deceit. And you will remember back in chapter 7 that he had said the world hates him because he shows up the evil that is actually there. Now, why does Jesus say to the man who slapped him in the face, "Why are you doing this?" There is a text in the Synoptic Gospels, I think it's St. Luke, where you're told that if somebody slaps you on the face, you should turn the other cheek. And people wonder, should this be taken literally? And you can see quite clearly that here Jesus doesn't turn the other cheek. So you have to ask the question, is Jesus not obeying his own teaching? No, he's asking you to understand his teaching. Because he doesn't mean it physically. He doesn't mean that you're supposed to take every piece of abuse that comes to you. That's not what he's saying. Turning the other cheek here is that Jesus has decided to surrender into the hands of sinners for the sake of redeeming those very sinners. He wants to redeem Annas and Caiaphas and the priesthood and the Sanhedrin and the scribes and the Pharisees and absolutely everybody else, right down to the last man on the planet. But if somebody needlessly offers him violence, he wants that particular individual to own their own violence so that they don't have to be part of taking responsibility for the death of the Son of God. He wants that man to think, to step back and not be part of it. So he's actually being very merciful to the man who has slapped him in the face. And that man was obviously trying to make an impression before Annas and maybe, get some kind of result from Annas in future times. But Jesus is saying, don't get involved. Not if you don't have to. Because the issues that are going on here are far too great. Far too great. So don't get involved. The other thing is to see that Jesus fears no man. Now, there's loads of scriptures that will point to you that anyone who has a true, living, steady, powerful relationship with God will not fear any human being. And so if we cower before the so-called greats or the so-called elites of the earth, then it means there's something really wrong in our understanding of who we are. So I want to pick up now in verse 24. Annas sent him still bound to Caiaphas the high priest. It's all of a sudden. So the abuse that Jesus received from the guards is actually at the time when he is present with Caiaphas. Now, John doesn't deal with Jesus going before Caiaphas. He doesn't deal with that. And that is the great trial of Jesus before the Sanhedrin in the Synoptic Gospels. Now, why doesn't John deal with it? The reason is that what John did was all the issues that needed to be dealt with before Caiaphas and before the Sanhedrin were dealt with in the first half of the Gospel during the public ministry of Jesus. And that's why you get the great controversies from chapter 5 to chapter 9, because all the issues are there. And as I've said to you many times, that Jesus was on trial before the people of Israel and before their leaders, all during his ministry. So he's not going to repeat it here. It would take too long. He has dealt with all the issues, but he is just simply admitting that there were two high priests, and it was not sufficient to go before Annas. The real high priest was Caiaphas. And so the legal trial, in which there will be accusers, even though they will give false accusation, that's all going to happen before Caiaphas, but it's not in John's gospel. And you just need to see the way John deals with things. And the next big thing for John is the trial before Pilate, and we'll give as much attention to that as we can, because for John, this is the real trial. Jesus has already been tried before the Sanhedrin in his public ministry in the first part of the gospel. The trial before Pilate is Jesus' trial before the whole world, before the cosmos, before the unbelieving world. And that's coming up in the next episode. Thank you for listening. Slán agus Banach Day live. Goodbye. God bless you.
My life is a miracle. Every child has a story of God's love to share. Shalom world, tune into God's love story.